So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to work through some pretty basic stuff. I bet a lot of you have seen some of these concepts before. They're in most graduate level hydrology classes. And then maybe some things you haven't seen in relation to modeling and how it can help us understand upscaling processes. So I'm going to walk through infiltration, modeling surface and subsurface flow, runoff generation at the point scale, a little bit about heterogeneity, and then some thoughts about upscaling runoff generation from the hill slope scale. So we all should have read chapters 8 and 9 in Broussard and chapter 8 in Dingman. You guys didn't get the reading assignments. OK. At any rate, most of the material is actually packaged. Hydrology suffers from not having the perfect hydrology book. I teach from both these books, and as a personal aside, since we're being videotaped, this is going out to the world, it would be awesome for somebody, of course not me, but somebody to write a hydrology book that sort of blends Broussard's rigor with Dingman's practicality. Anyway, OK, so first note side, what controls infiltration? Start jotting down some things as you think about this. And we look at our beautiful Wikipedia page of probably a soccer field being heavily sprinkled. So we have general features of infiltration, and we often use the Richards equation in various forms. And I'm showing a simplified form in 1D of Richards equation that I like to use because I like to pull these things apart. So we have change in storage. We have flow due to capillary pressures. And then we have our gravity drainage part pulled out, and it's on the side. And we're thinking about entry of water into the soil. We can assume that air can escape freely. Of course, it can't. Our soil profile is initially partially saturated. And when we think about how infiltration happens, of course, we've all seen this a million times. If rainfall is heavy enough, portions of the rainfall don't infiltrate. They pond. We get puddles because we're exceeding some maximum rate known as infiltration capacity. If the rainfall isn't heavy enough, all of it seeps into the ground, and infiltration is limited by what we call rainfall infiltration. We can come up with a nice little conceptual model of this. We have some ponded water, or we have some rainfall infiltration. Now, we think about how we understand, or our theory for rainfall infiltration, which is pretty elegant and pretty straightforward. We think about infiltration capacity. We make a bunch of assumptions: deep layer, homogeneous, unsaturated soil, covered by a thin film of water, so we don't have any pressure boundary conditions to deal with. And we have a boundary condition of nothing. And then we set the head, pressure head, to be 0 exactly at the ground surface. Watch infiltration happen. Now, early time is crazy, right? We've got this gargantuan pressure difference. We have all sorts of absorptive. That first term in that equation that I showed is going nuts. We're going to ignore that part for now. We're going to jump to the later term behavior. The system settles down a little bit. And after longer infiltration times, our water content near the surface becomes pretty uniform. And our pressure goes towards atmospheric. And so if we jump back to our equations, this means our d theta dz term goes to 0. This means our change in pressure head also goes to 0. So what does that mean? So we can unravel this and say, OK, means our change, all that's left in that equation, so our change in head with respect to the vertical dimension is -1. So if we plug in Darcy's law, we call our f of c this infiltration. In the limit, we get our infiltration equal to our saturated hydraulic conductivity, or our K0 in that diagram I showed earlier. So this means, very simply, that saturated hydraulic conductivity over the column, given all these conditions, saturated hydraulic conductivity is our lever. That's our knob for how much infiltration enters the subsurface versus ponds. OK, so that's a pretty simple concept. It's really kind of hydrology 501, if you will, right? Usually graduate level, but pretty basic. All right, let's put that aside for a second. Let's think about infiltrometer. How many of you have used an infiltrometer? Awesome. So again, just jot down infiltrometer. when you've used an infiltrometer, and I know from the hill slopes in Colorado, infiltrometer basically, you watch how the water falls, and you're getting at, effectively, Ksat by watching this relationship. And as you move around on the hill slope with your infiltrometer, sometimes the water goes super quickly, sometimes it never goes. All right, let's file that away. So part B in this, how do we set up modeling surface and subsurface flow? And I've talked a lot about what we can do with models and sort of what they represent, but I haven't actually talked much about how these models work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So we start with Richard's equation, and this is now the mixed form of Richard's equation. I wasn't showing the mixed form before. So the mixed form that we solve, and I'll define some terminology. We have a pressure head, and this is the subsurface pressure, either positive for below the water table, negative for above the water table. And I'm calling the subsurface version of this pressure psi p. Then we have a specific storage. We have a saturation. This is Richard's equation, so saturation 1 to 1 depends on pressure. We have a porosity. And this, of course, is some mixed system that we're, mixed multi-phase system that we're simplifying and solving in an implied second phase or implied air phase at some RAV type scale. We have a control volume, and it's important to note this is our incompressible storage side. This is our divergence of flux. I'll talk about Q in just a second. This could be, QS could be any kind of exchange, source sink. And this is our change in storage. So this is basically our compressibility of the matrix, our compressibility of water. Of course, the compressibility of the matrix is much larger. Units on this equation are 1 over time. So of course, we have Darcy's law, often called Darcy-Buckingham, which is gradient of our subsurface pressure plus or minus our vertical coordinate. We have a relative permeability term, which depends 1 to 1 on our subsurface pressure, and then our saturated hydraulic conductivity. This Ks is the same Ks I was talking about before. We also have Overland Flow. And so we can write the continuity equation for Overland Flow. Now we have a control volume. Psi p is our pressure head in the subsurface. Psi s is our pressure head in the surface. We have 2 pressures at this point. This is our change in storage. This is our divergence of our flow. Notice psi s is the height of our ponded water, so it's also a coordinate, and it's a pressure. And then we have our fluxes, and then we have a V relationship, which comes from our depth discharge relationship. Depth discharge, I'm writing Manning's equation. You could use others, Darcy-Weisbach, or Shezzy. And I'm writing this as the friction slope. We could simplify this to be the bed slope, but we have a relationship for our depth discharge, which goes in to give us our Q. Okay. So if we want to couple these 2 equations, which is really at sort of the heart of these integrated codes, there's 2 main approaches that have mathematically and through the literature been developed. The first we call a flux continuity between surface water and groundwater. The first is a flux continuity, so we derive some new flux, some new equation. We say we've got that pressure in S in the surface, pressure P in the subsurface. We write a relationship between them. That new flux, that's our exchange term. And the second one is a pressure continuity. And this enforces that the pressure at the bottom of the surface water column is equal to the top of the groundwater column. So if we talk about this flux or conductance concept, we can write our surface system. I've now simplified this to the kinematic wave equation. We write our subsurface system. This is Richard's equation. Notice that our source sink terms, we've got this QE. That's our Q exchange. So we now have to write a new equation for this Q exchange flux, right? And this is just the difference between our surface and subsurface pressure. We have some proportionality constant. And then our exchange, because the units are different, we have this M prime in between. Now, what this means is that we impose some interface. There's always some resistance between these 2 terms. And we can think about either conceptually or technically, whether that makes sense. Is there a distinct interface? Is there something special about the skin between surface and subsurface? Are there interface properties, interface dynamics? Maybe. We can also think about technical issues. We have very different timescales between these systems. Often we need some kind of an iterative solution to make sure that we converge these timescales or account for these timescales. This can give us all sorts of numerical issues between mass and numerical instability. And then underlying a lot of this, which is a theme I'm going to pick up quite a bit, is uncertainty in our parameters. Right? We have uncertainty in our K, we have uncertainty in our Mannings and others, and then we've introduced a new parameter which we also have uncertainty in. So if we think about what the general pressure formulation does, now we rewrite our psi to be a psi p, right here, to be equal to our psi s. So we replace this with just one pressure. So we take the kinematic wave equation, and instead of writing these as a new relationship, we say, OK, we have just one single pressure. And if we substitute this single pressure in, we get a very interesting relationship. This is now solving for our exchange flux. We solve our continuity equation for Overland Flow for our exchange flux. And we get these two operations that have dependencies on them. So these two vertical lines mean the greater of psi, our pressure, or 0. And so what happens, again, jot this down in your little notepad. Think about what happens when psi is less than 0. We're in suction. We should be unsaturated. So if our pressure is less than 0, we should have unsaturated conditions. And that means that we shouldn't have any overland flow at all. And so these terms need to disappear. So that's why there's the switch between the greater of these and 0. What happens then? Our exchange flux is just our rainfall flux, or ET, or general source sink on the top of the model. We get a general Neumann type boundary condition. If we have, for any reason, pressure at the surface greater than 0, now we have ponded water. That ponded water needs to go somewhere. And so we turn on our Overland Flow equations. So now we can embed this in our Neumann type boundary condition, do a little bit of math, and what we get is this really interesting, what we call the Overland Flow boundary condition, or the combination of our Darcy's law, Neumann boundary condition, and the Overland Flow equations. OK, so that was a lot of math, but what does this mean? What's a good simulation example or way to think about this? So the best way we've found to sort of explain this is what we call the slab case. And you can think of the slab case as being a gravel hill slope, right? Make up whatever I want, it's a model, with a concrete pad right in the middle, and I sprinkle the whole thing. Now again, jot down your little piece of paper, what's going to happen over the concrete slab? We're going to have almost instantaneous runoff over this low K. Everywhere else, if we have super high K, we should have all infiltration. Now we can look at the outflow, and we can look at the outflow for an all concrete case. We can look at the outflow for a no slab case, and then we can think about what the difference is. And I'll walk us through this. So this is our initial condition. This is simulation. We start out at time 0. We have unsaturated conditions, and we fixed the water table to be pretty close to the ground surface to make this interesting. We step forward in time. We don't have any ponding at the outlet yet, so we don't have any runoff. We have a ton of runoff over this slab. And we have runoff and then focused reinfiltration. And it's still dry under the slab. We keep raining. We build up more focused infiltration. We're still running off right on the top of the slab. No runoff out at the outlet. We keep going. We see we have an infiltration front building up. We're really pounding this thing with rain. Now we saturate at the outlet. We start to see the slab case all of a sudden respond really quickly. And at the end of the simulation, we see that we're saturated. We still have some unsaturated conditions underneath the slab. Now, This example is just to sort of show the dynamics of these processes. And we can think about this now in our part C in terms of runoff generation mechanisms. So we bring this back to runoff and bring this back to thinking about runoff and scaling runoff. And we typically think of runoff by two mechanisms: infiltration excess, which we just talked about, right? Precip is greater than our Ksat, water ponds up, and we generate runoff. And then saturation excess, often called Dunnian flow, infiltration excess, often called Hortonian flow, although it has been said many times in the literature, Horton was not strictly Hortonian. Saturation excess, or Dunn flow, water table is involved. Now there's a lot of other conceptual models, like subsurface storm flow and partial area, infiltration excess, and different sorts of things. So this is from Broussard. Really nice example. We have a hill slope, precipitation. Basically, we're ponding the water everywhere. This is like our parking lot test. Ponding the water everywhere, and we're running off. We can run this with a model. Run this. This happens to be Parflow, and it's one of the most boring movies ever. Why is it so boring? Well, it's really boring because all you're doing is you're saturating at the very top layer. You're generating runoff. The runoff's running down this hill slope. Water table isn't engaged. We get barely any infiltration. But this is that runoff mechanism.
It's 1D model, no? You've got 2D things.
This is a 2D hill slope. This is the model domain, is the...
But the only variable is X, no? Or you model the water depth?
This is saturation. So here's the water table, right? It's a 3D model. It's homogeneous over 2D. So it's effectively 2D, even though it's a 3D model. But we have ponding on the ground surface. We have a water table, very unsaturated conditions everywhere else. We just generate runoff from the top. Now we can think about saturation excess or Dunn flow, right? Now we have infiltration. We have some water table that's generally pretty close. That water table is now engaged in the process and starts moving. And that's what generates our runoff. The infiltration contributes to the water table movement. We can model this as well. So now we started the water table close, right? We generate water table lateral movement. We get a mound. We're generating runoff across these areas. We can also do subsurface storm flow, right? We have some bedrock layer. We have a really limited depth. Water infiltrates, starts booking it along this bedrock interface. And what happens? Well, we see that we very quickly, blue is ponding, we get saturation. Notice that this isn't linear, so we're getting a lot of lateral flow, and we generate runoff along this hill slope transect. Okay, we can even plot outflow. This is our Horton case. This is our Dunn case. This is our storm flow case. Huge lag, but then it really starts running off. Okay, so maybe we have some confidence that our models represent these really basic runoff processes. So let's get to sort of part D, or heterogeneity. Jot down, of course, if our material is different from one location to the next, it's heterogeneous. Now your thought experiment, does the scale of observation make heterogeneous material appear more or less so? Okay. Part D, heterogeneity is reality. We can look at this in a stream bed cross-section. We can look at this in Cape Cod. This is just for you, Comedy. Those of us that were in the Cape Cod area and never did work there, it's like burned into our image, into our minds. And of course, as done very often, we can characterize heterogeneity using geostatistics. So we have a low K layer here with some coarser material. We can characterize the properties of the entire media. We can also characterize some proportional length scales. And there's a ton of theory about how we do this mathematically. We do this in the so-called stochastic sense, where we use a Reynolds decomposition a mean plus a perturbation, where our average of our property is equal to the mean. Our perturbation goes to 0, but the mean of the perturbation squared goes to something like the variance of our log k. We have some correlation, and we can define some geometric mean of our system. And we show a Gaussian random field image here, where we've got some log k, some variance of log k, and some spatial correlation. OK, this is probably the most well-used and basic geostatistical model out there. And there's, of course, way more sophisticated approaches. But what happens if we take this type of an approach now and revisit our simple runoff cases? What do we get? Well, we can look at something that's kind of like our infiltration excess. So our k is relatively low, but it's heterogeneous. We get some infiltration, not very much. We get a lot of ponding, but not complete ponding. And we start to develop maybe a little bit more realistic model of the system. And we can look at what this curve looks like, and we start to get something that's kind of in between our two cases. We can up the k a little bit. This is now more like a heterogeneous Dunn flow case. Water table's engaged, but it's not quite as engaged. And so we can start to think about how we might use heterogeneity and these models to represent these systems. And so our last piece is going to be, how well do these traditional estimates of stream generation or runoff generation work? And this is where, as I say in my class, hydrology usually splits. Because most hydrologists walk through a lot of the theory, go out in the field, see something like this, and say, I'm out. I give up. This is way too complicated. I'm never going to represent this much heterogeneity. We're never going to be able to model this. So we have to come up with another way. We have to come up with a large-scale approximation, or we have to calibrate effective parameters, or do something else. Of course, not me. I will keep banging my head against that wall forever. So, no. I mean, I think the other path is to say, well, yes, we're never going to be perfect, but we're going to mechanistically start to understand how this system might be put together. And so if we think about the traditional wisdom, right, we just derived that KSAT is this dividing line between our ponding and infiltration. And we have these distributions of KSAT. We just showed some. So we could really easily say, well, if this distribution, saturated hydraulic conductivity, tells us how much runoff is going to happen, if we know what our rainfall is and we know what this distribution is, then we know what percent of our hill slope or our watershed is running off. And we can really test these assumptions. And so what does this look like? Here's just a bunch of log normal distributions. And I've normalized this so that the x-axis is our Q rain over our kg. Log normal distribution, we've fixed, these are all CDFs, we've fixed that because of the way the distributions work, all of our distributions are going to be 50th percentile at QR, our rainfall rate, over the geometric mean of a hydraulic conductivity, value of 1. If we take a QR of kg of 1/2, depending on our distribution, if we have a really steep, a really large variance, we should have very little runoff generation. If we have a very low variance, we should have very little runoff generation. If we have a very high variance, we're going to have more runoff generation. And we should scale proportionally to variance of log k. We should have more runoff generation the larger our variance is. If we jump to past QR kg over 1, we now should flip, right? We should be pretty much running off everywhere in our low k case, right? As we approach a 0, it's just a switch. No runoff or runoff, depending on what our rainfall value is. And then our largest distributions, we have this really long tail. If we go out to variances of 10, we should still have large portions of the domain that aren't generating runoff. And this is actually not too different from, say, variable infiltration capacity or a lot of other approaches that use this. They use other things too. They also have some history, but this is sort of the basic idea. And so we can run a bunch of model simulations for this. In this case, we have increasing heterogeneity. So our variance goes up from 0.1 to 10. And then we have increasing rainfall, 0.5, 1, and 1. Our flow is from the top of the hill slopes here, the bottom of the hill slopes here. Blue is deeper runoff, deeper water. Red and white are lower ponded water. We see down here, low K, low variance, low rainfall rate. We have almost no runoff generated. Here we have high variance, high rainfall rate, and we're ponding and generating some pretty interesting distributions of runoff. Okay, so we can run ensembles of this. We can look at behavior. And so this is normalized rainfall rate. This is a normalized time. So time of 1 is just when we turned off the rain. And then we go from small to large variance. And what do we see? We go from, as we go from small to large variance, we expect to follow this curve. Small variance will be the least runoff generated. Large variance will be the most. And what do we see? We see exactly that. We see small variance, least runoff, largest variance, most runoff. Okay, seems pretty intuitive. Now as we jump to the medium rainfall rate, everything should be generating 50% runoff. And we don't have anything generating 50% runoff. And these, by the way, are our ensemble averages. So we ran 50 different realizations. Statistics were converged. And these are the average of those 50 realizations. So what's going on? We still have sorting in order of variance. And now we look at the QR over kg of 2, and we see that it's flipped. We should be expecting least runoff from the largest variance, and we're getting the most runoff from the largest variance. So what's going on? And we can look at this in total runoff 2 as a function of variance of log k, but really it shows that our simple theory doesn't work. And why is that? It's because our simple theory doesn't include connection. And we can look at a snapshot from a simulation and see that we have lots of places where we generate runoff, water flows downhill, we hit a high K unit, and we reinfiltrate. And so for Hortonian runoff, it's completely path dependent. And it's only when we say, well, let's just look at the percent saturated area that we get exactly the behavior that the theory would predict. So the saturated area, the runoff generation mechanism locally, is exactly as we predict. But because we have a hill slope, water flows downhill, but can reinfiltrate, the overall system doesn't upscale as simply as we predict. All right, and we can even say, let's run some really large, these are non-dimensionalized, 72 integral scale wide catchments. We can run really large, successively larger and larger catchments to see if we ever get to some ergodic limit. We don't, except for really high heterogeneity and really high rainfall rate. So if most hydrologists had already given up, everybody else has by this point, because there's no ergodic limit. There's not really like, it's not really like a lot of, bright light here. But not me. So we can keep going, and we can keep thinking about scaling different runoff mechanisms, because this was just Hortonian flow. What about Dunn flow? What about subsurface flow? And so we can generate a very simple study to look at Dunn flow as well. So now we have a fully 3D hill slope. We have substantial amount of depth, same simple Gaussian, correlated Gaussian random field. We have flow direction moving downhill. But we set this system up so that we put the water table very close to the outlet, so that the water table is very engaged in runoff production. And what happens? Now if we look for a high rainfall rate and a low rainfall rate, this is dimensionless time, this is our dimensionless outflow, and the curves, the different colors, are different variances of hydraulic conductivity, and they all collapse on top of each other. So we get completely the opposite behavior. Heterogeneity is running the show for Hortonian runoff, but it's not really playing any appreciable role for Dunn flow. And if we jump and say, okay, well, let's just change our kg, so we now normalize, change our kg, so our kg changes not dimensionless with our rainfall rate, we now get our average hydraulic conductivity has everything to do with our runoff generation for Dunnian flow. So we get exactly the opposite behavior. For Horton flow, our heterogeneity controls the runoff generation. For Dunn flow, our geometric mean controls the runoff generation. And so we can think about this. We can think about this in summary. But what I think is important is that, one, we can start to explore upscaling mathematically these very simple concepts out to larger scales. And then we can also think about how some of these systems that we study connect. Subsurface heterogeneity really impacts our Hortonian hill slope runoff. Dunnian or water table generated flow averages out much more easily. And incidentally, I mean, the whole reason that simulations like the CONUS work is bullet 2. Right? This is why, because we're getting this effective behavior pretty quickly for subsurface flow, this is why these systems average up. This is why our models can work at larger scales. If it was all about this small scale, it would never work at all. And of course, the real world's complex. We can use models to inform upscaling. And we can think about paths forward. This is some work that used, this is KL expansion. So we have each of the nodes. And this is a 4,000 realization. It's a tilted V. It's not just a straight hill slope. And this is using a dimension reduction and model reduction strategy. This is actually an active variable. So this is a plot of the entire heterogeneous modes of the heterogeneity and cumulative runoff. And we see some pretty nice relationships emerging that can help us inform model reduction strategies. Or we can borrow a page from Keith Logue, who in the R5 catchment saw very similar behavior, which he termed as Dunton flow, or this marriage of Dunn and Hortonian Overland flow.
When you look at transport in this type of media, I think it usually shows that these simple statistical models may not be sufficient to explain it. You need more, let's say, geological structure. So do you think adding geological structure in these type of models would somehow change your conclusions if you move away from, let's say, these quite, like you said, simple statistical?
Yes. So I think the answer is yes and yes. And I think a really nice analogy in transport is that if you looked at, and this is sort of the ergodic limit in terms of point source of contamination. So if you looked at ensembles or perturbation, small variance, perturbation expansions of transport, and you said, okay, I have a very small plume size. That point plume is sampling a very small amount of the heterogeneity. And so there, you need large ensembles and you have trickier upscaling, whereas really large plumes are sampling lots of heterogeneity, and that's tending to be more ergodic or more averaged. And I think this is similar. I think there's some analogy there between the Hortonian and Dunn flow. What I think is important is that this is all really just a way to look at the math of this system without actually having to do math. I'm not very good at math. And so somebody could probably expand these systems and get the exact same sorts of results from an analytical expansion of the system looking at the, what happens with the terms that have heterogeneity in them. And really that's kind of what this is, right? It's not saying these are real hill slopes. This is saying this is a form of heterogeneity that is used a lot but is not, as you say, perfect or as realistic as it could be. And so then what this means is that for a real system, there might be other aspects of the heterogeneity. There might be larger, features. There might be, interactions with topography, all sorts of things that play a larger role. And so I think that in the real world, the real world's complex, and I think that's important. But what this tells you is that for groundwater-driven flow, for groundwater-driven runoff, the small-scale heterogeneity doesn't matter, and probably the larger scale matters more. John, did you have a question?
Yeah. You've focused on conductivity, but sorptivity really controls infiltration for the first capillary length scale, which is typically about 30 centimeters of soil or so. And the sorptivity, instead of going with the square of the particle size, goes with the square root of the particle size. So it's much more uniform than is saturated conductivity. So the first thing I want to do is have you kind of reflect on infiltration processes that are the fact that sorptivity really limits heterogeneity as a player. So,
okay, finish your question and then I'll start answering.
The second piece deals with the fact that we don't really see runoff typically. That it's kind of a mythical event, and so we don't. So if you walk outside and it's raining hard, it's almost never do you see surface runoff.
Right.
And so what's really going on?
Okay. Point one, yes. All of the things you said are in my sorptivity lecture, in the early time lecture, and I skipped over that just sort of for time. But you're right. But typically what limits, in these dry systems, what limits sort of this runoff production is still K. And we've played around with Van Guncken functions and Van Guncken parameters and things like this. And it just, for short-term, very dry systems, plays less of a role. But I think that, of course, sorptivity matters, all these, all the terms are important, but I think sort of the leading behavior is saturated hydraulic conductivity for these kinds of systems. Now, part two of your question further reinforces why our models work at larger scale. I think what we're seeing, we don't really see a lot of quote-unquote Horton runoff. And if you start to look at the more modernized type literature, it looks like most of the water takes a path through groundwater, most of the snowmelt takes a path through groundwater. And because groundwater averages up, because the groundwater-driven flow processes average up, I think this is maybe serendipity as to why our models are more accurate, because we're really just trying to get this average behavior and the heterogeneity starts dropping out. But
what drives stream flow generation in intermittent streams?
in intermittent streams, so there it's really about the supply of water in seasonality. And there can be a lot of mechanisms for this, but basically if you have, say, a seasonal pulse like a snowmelt signal or a snowmelt pulse, you have water that moves in, that water displaces other water and pushes up, and you have storage that exceeds, I sort of think of it as this, exceeds the capacity, and then you start running off into the stream. But then if the system is set up just so, and the stream drains out, and your storage drops below, your water table drops below the stream bed, then your stream ceases to flow. And so what's interesting about the formulation that we have in Parflow is that we see this as a really good tool for understanding this, because we don't say that streams have to be there. We don't say that water has to flow. Conditions have to provide flow. Conditions have to provide for that. And so then if you've got enough water, if you've got enough supply to maintain the stream flow, it will. But if it's intermittent, it also will go away. Great questions, by the way. I think you're...
Yeah, this might be a redundant question, but you said that heterogeneity tends to average out at larger scales. So wouldn't it then just be easier to take an effective sort of average permeability and work at larger scales instead of, doing something that has a finer resolution, but in the end will be the same?
So, yes, but topography, as you move to larger scales, you are able to represent less and less of the effects of topography. And so in one sense, I think the subsurface heterogeneity gets easier at large scale, but topography gets harder, if you will, or you're losing more information from topography. And I think that's a pretty tricky balance between those two. Other things like land cover, and of course we're not talking about soils, we're not talking about between storms, we're only talking about dry conditions and rainfall on dry soil. So between storms, soil heterogeneity has a lot to do with how soil and subsurface heterogeneity has a lot to do with plants' accessibility to water and all of these sorts of things. So on the other side of it, I think that it's a different set of processes. But these are good points.
I've always thought that the heterogeneity is scale dependent. So the heterogeneity you find in a small scale may disappear when you upscale, but other kinds of heterogeneity may pop up that we're not taking into account, right?
Yes. So, were you honest and did you jot this down? I'm trying to pull up the little thought bullet here. Did you jot this down, or did you just like?
No, I mean, I've always.
I'm teasing you. Sorry. No, but I think you're absolutely right. And so one of the some work that's in review right now from one of my current PhD students. She's actually finding a heavy scale dependence of effective hydraulic conductivity. And I tend to think of it as there is, at some fine scale, a representation of the heterogeneity, a representation of the hydraulic conductivity that is fixed. But we're almost never working at that scale. Maybe the MAID site, maybe the paper that came out of Dave Heineman's group, maybe they're getting at that scale. But we're almost always averaging up. We're almost always missing information. And so we always have this effective representation of that parameter. And so it's scale dependent because of heterogeneity, because of topography, because of all of these other features. And so it's always this sort of sliding thing or scale dependent quantity. But I would agree with you in your assessment or your.
Yeah,
Jeff?
I think that's a good question. I want to follow up.
Sure.
I'm not a hydrologist, I'm in geological science, and so I see permeability as just a fake thing that's created to represent geological variability, which is a function of geological processes that have taken place at many, many, many scales.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that, and I'd like to have you comment on that, of course, the groundwater community doesn't measure all of those things as compared to, say, oil reservoir community. They measure all those things, and therefore they see, even in geophysical data, large scale heterogeneity over tens and tens of kilometers. So the question perhaps could be that it's just not been discovered to the extent, in the sense that we don't have measurements that indicate, okay, now I've gone into subsurface and I've taken over large distances, geophysical surfaces, which all companies do, right? And actually measured faults and changes in stratigraphy and changes in lithology, because as the one person said, even a simple kind of exponential type notional model, you can apply to a large scale, but it will miss a lot of these realistic features. So the question is a little bit for me is, when are we going to see the groundwater community looking at sort of this larger scale geological discontinuities?
That's why we need you here, Jeff. That's why. No, I'm serious. I mean, I think this is the whole point, right? So it is. It's a really important piece, and I think that there's going to be a lot of different. There are a lot of new ways to observe or infer the subsurface, but there's still a long way to go, I think. And I think that we've moved beyond sort of this just direct pincushion approach to many different geophysical techniques, but I think that we need to really expand out the thinking and kind of merge these fields. And this is a little bit why I gave this particular version of the talk, because it's just enough. It's like very basic geostatistics, but there's so much more. There's so much more you could do with a real site. There's so much more if you blended these different approaches. And I think that's really what's going to help us understand how water moves in these larger systems. I really think that's important. And you know, it's often a resource thing. It's often hydrologists don't have the resources to bring to bear the types of techniques that the extractive industries have. But I think that we should. I think we should piggyback on these for sure, or the numerical techniques. I mean, there's so much more beyond what I've shown in terms of geostatistical simulation. Sure.
Yeah, my question goes in a similar direction. There are people who try to combine hydrological models and more like landscape evolution models.
Mm-hmm.
Because you said heterogeneity, so I wonder if like, isn't that if you have like, for example, erosion processes going on, that you reduce the heterogeneity? So I just think of like erosion gullies and then oil runoff goes that. So you actually over certain time scales it changes, so the heterogeneity changes, and then I thought maybe one should come up with measures of connectivity, like if one pond fills up and now there's a connect to the next pond and things like that.
Yes.
The second question is,
Okay.
Do you think that these models would benefit from introducing like more small-scale soil surface processes? Like I was thinking of crusting due to after stormfall, like when the power of the rainfall destroys the soil aggregate structure and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's not in those time scales?
Okay, so two pieces of this. One, I think you raised some really interesting points. And there's been a few papers, and I know one out of Jim Kirchner's group, that talked about reasons why Manning's Inn should be pretty homogeneous along streams, which I think is actually very interesting, but it's exactly these points, that there's a lot of averaging processes that would tend to normalize or make these systems more uniform. And I think these sorts of insights are really fascinating to me. But I haven't really thought a lot about how that would, there's a lot of ways that this could fit into this kind of framework, but I haven't thought that through as much. And then point number two, I think is really interesting. And this is kind of a little bit my philosophy on this sort of work and where we should push and when we should push models ahead of the observations, which is sometimes an unpopular theory or unpopular approach. And what I mean by that is these are synthetic simulations and we see these kinds of relationships. And normally people will take models and they'll say, okay, let's instrument a site, let's look at the site, and then let's model the behavior on the back end instead of modeling sort of in this forward prediction sense. And my talk yesterday, with groundwater subsidies for plant transpiration, T over ET ratio, it's the same sort of thing. The idea is that with the physics we have, with Richard's equation, with what's there, this is what we see. These are relationships we see. Let's test that. Probably certainly in one sense it's going to be wrong, right? But whether or not the behavior, whether or not the trends are correct, which is what I'm more interested in. Do we see increases with heterogeneity, decreases with heterogeneity? Do we see increases with water table depth, decreases with water table depth? Do we see these broad categories? To the extent that we get that right, then that means that our current model physics are sufficient to describe these sorts of things. If we can really show, look, you know what, over this time, no, it's not working. Then we say, all right, well, what are we missing in terms of physics? And I think it's really important because there's so many signals that look the same and can be explained by different ways, by different mathematical techniques, that it's very hard. You can fit a signal in a non-unique way, not just with different parameters, different combinations of the same parameter, but different conceptual models. And that's where I think things are really interesting and things are really challenging in hydrology. Because then we need to understand, okay, all the processes you mentioned, crusting, this, this is hypothesized in the West African model to be one of the big runoff generation processes, and it sort of gets worn down, and they're trying to understand to what extent that matters. And these are really interesting questions, but I think that what we want to do is sort of get in this iterative approach to see, well, what can we describe with the math we have? And then when that fails, what do we need more? What's the next step? And that's kind of my philosophy on this. But those are great points.
So just to chase down a little bit more of my first point,
Yeah.
or question, Horton was in the 30s,
Mm-hmm.
40s, 50s, and Jeff McDonald is alive still today,
Mm-hmm.
and he's talking about interflow.
Mm-hmm.
And since we don't really see water running off,
Mm-hmm.
what would be the hydrologic implications if Jeff were right? If it's really interflow, and why do we care? Why should we care? And why should we or should we not let go of these Hortonian, Dunnian concepts?
So if we think about it and we think, okay, what's interflow? Well, this could be these fast heterogeneous pathways, right? Conceptually, these higher K, faster paths that are not distributed over the entire system. This is a lot like Jeff's interflow. You think of it as a heterogeneous subsurface storm flow, right? So you have these connected interflow pathways and you get very fast response. And so the reason that I sort of like the Horton and Dunn is that this is like a small scale. This is the point scale. And we have really nice theory at the column. We have well accepted. Pretty much everybody teaches it in hydrology. But then how does this assemble and how does this upscale? And that's really the piece that I'm getting at. I'm not saying the world is Hortonian or Dunnian. I'm saying the world is the world. And we have a couple different descriptions. And how do we start to mathematically upscale these to see what we get and to see how they might assemble in physics, in the PDEs. And so that's sort of what I'm getting at. And I think that probably to an extent, we do have strong heterogeneity. The question is, does that strong heterogeneity average out, and do we get relatively fast response because of this interflow or because of this sort of pressure propagation within the system? There's a lot of things that will give us this same kind of fast response of more subsurface type flow.